Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome you all to this afternoon's event called the Censorship Network Regulation and Repression in Germany. Today, I would very much like to introduce or to greet or to welcome Andrew Lowenthal, who has basically written this study on the censorship network, on the subtle mechanisms of censorship in Germany. Andrew, I think it's fair to say that you have dedicated, I would say, your career to detecting that sort of mechanisms, that sort of censorship in what's called the free world, so to speak. And I think you have done that in various countries. You have looked at these matters in the US and Australia and Southeast Asia. And I guess what you have found out about Germany, when I read it, I must really say I was I was really surprised, and I was to some extent even shocked. And it makes you think about how censorship nowadays works completely differently from what people understand under censorship. Do recall I once had a discussion with the Russian ambassador, and he said, "Well, there is censorship in Germany." And then I said, "No, there is no such thing as we have in Russia, where you basically are not allowed to call what's going on in Ukraine a war, but you have to call it a special military operation." Then I thought about, well, there are so many things that you don't dare to say, particularly in the context of this war, that he may be right that there is such thing as censorship, but just based on very different mechanisms as we know them from what some people call totalitarian states. And I think what you have done here is a very, very thorough study on the mechanism, how this works. And I'm very curious, you're going to present sort of the core themes of this study in the next 25 minutes. I may also, or I'm pleased to also welcome Aya Velázquez. Aya Velázquez, not a musician, but a freelance journalist. A lot of people know her because she became famous and maybe for some people notorious during the COVID days, and most recently when she released the RKI, the Robert Koch Institute files, that sort of disclosed things that some people were surprised and some people couldn't even believe. So thank you very much for your work here. And Ulrike Guérot, it's a great pleasure to have you here. I mean, Ulrike, I think we know each other for more than 10 years. I do recall the first time I met with you is when I invited you to the City Hall in Düsseldorf on the occasion of Europe Day 2016. 16, I believe it was. And ever since in these days, I thought, well, this is this sort of mainstream, Europe enthusiast, rather on the conservative side, CDU, but probably a very, very successful professor in the German education system. And then we met again and again. And I guess the first time when you sort of made headlines not exactly in line with what I initially thought of you was during the COVID time, when you basically said things that I considered for self-evident, that some of the measures taken were clearly not in line with the principles of a free liberal society. And it was quite stunning how much criticism you got for that. And the next event was the Ukraine war, where you were basically outcast for also self-evident statements such as, of course, this war also had a history before it started. And this all of a sudden were things that were no longer allowed to say. And I guess, this is an example of surveys nowadays show that more and more people are reluctant to speak their mind in Germany for a system of censorship, as I said, that works very different from sort of the common understanding of censorship. And that is why this study of Andrew is so relevant and important, and very much looking forward to your presentation on it right now. Maybe from Andrew will present 25 minutes, then Aya, you have some 15, 20 minutes for your experience, and Ulrike is at the same time, I would say, and then we have a discussion for 15, 20, maybe 30 minutes, and then everybody's invited to some munchies over there. I guess they are. So thanks for all of you. Thanks to all of you for coming. And maybe I would like to welcome in particular André Hunko, a former member of the Bundestag, who came just from Aachen, hopefully, but it's not so far away. But thanks. Thank you so much for giving us the honor. Thank you very much.
Hello, 1, 2, 3. Now I'm good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas, for inviting me to speak here. Also, thank you to Aya and Ulrike for coming as well. This is, yes, as Thomas said, a topic very dear to my heart. Really, for the last 25 years, I've been working on issues of digital authoritarianism, free speech online, privacy, online privacy issues, etc. Previously, I used to run a nonprofit in Southeast Asia or across Asia, particularly worked in places like Myanmar, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, Singapore, places that had, were very repressive when it came to speech online. And I dedicated a huge amount of my time to running this nonprofit that I founded, Engage Media, and working with local activists to kind of defend digital rights in these places, assuming that, the West had its problems, but there were much worse problems in these other countries. That turned out to not be true. And in fact, the last decade and the last 5 or so years in particular, I think Western countries are seeing a really huge assault on free speech. And so 3 years or so ago, I handed that NGO over and really pivoted my focus back towards Western countries. That led me to make contact with a investigative journalist called Matt Taibbi, who was one of the first journalists or reporters that was given access to something called the Twitter files, which was files, internal documentation of Twitter that were released by Twitter's or X's now new owner, Elon Musk. We can set aside Elon Musk's own problematic issues with X today. We can just quickly say that the promise of kind of free speech, I wouldn't say has been completely realized on the new Twitter, but those motivations or results aside, the story itself in terms of what those files revealed was incredibly important. And I essentially made contact with Matt Taibbi because he put a call out essentially for some assistance, because he was looking at all of these files. He was seeing all these NGOs. He was seeing these academic institutions, these liberal philanthropies, all interconnected, all meeting, all communicating with government agencies, etc. And he said, what is this? I don't know this world. I happen to know that world because as I mentioned, I'd spent almost 18 years running my own NGO that worked on these issues, that was getting money from kind of these liberal foundations, etc., that had worked with different academic institutions. So I basically started helping him understand what these networks were. So with him did a deep dive, and together essentially put together, and you can go to the next slide, Milos. We put together this map of what became known, or what another journalist called Michael Schellenberger had named the Censorship-Industrial Complex, but we essentially built, what is only 50 or 60 organizations here out of a list of about 300 that we developed, and these 50 or 60 that we wrote up in a report. It turns out that this was really just scratching the surface, and these were also mostly US organizations, a little bit of UK, and half a dozen at best beyond that. It turns out there really was a huge amount more going on than we had thought. One of the things that was really peculiar about this system, as I'd mentioned, was that I think people had often thought of censorship as coming from these kind of authoritarian right-wing governments or it had this very kind of stereotype or caricature of what modern censorship would look like. What it turned out was much more that censorship, particularly, say, during COVID, was actually made possible by a lot of progressive and liberal nonprofits and academic institutions who are conducting fact checks on things that often turned out to be incorrect or at least very much debatable. And this was my world. And I noticed this world that essentially pivoted from pushing for freedom of expression online to suddenly being in a panic about combating disinformation or combating hate speech. And because of this panic, coming up with all manner of justifications for why it was now okay to censor people on the internet. Now, that, of course, doesn't mean that there aren't really big problems with speech online. They're not, and there's a lot of very, very horrible speech. Sometimes there's actually very much illegal speech. I'm not an absolutist in that sense that says there should be no guardrails at all. But the problem has become that this kind of fact-checking or this anti-disinformation has become politically weaponized as a tool where one political group can attack and silence other political groups in order to dominate the narrative space. And one of the things I find quite difficult to communicate to a lot of my progressive and liberal friends is just as disinformation can be used as a kind of weapon of information warfare, so can the concept of so-called countering disinformation. This is an equally useful tool to silence people that you do not like. So we have to be extremely careful in how these kind of concepts are put to use. They're predominantly being put to use, I would argue, in the past 10 years or so, politically, not in any form of neutral way, even though there would be many people who suggest they are doing it out of neutrality. They have their own worldviews, even the people who are doing what they might consider the Lord's work and are not corrupted. But there are other people who are very much doing this knowingly, politically, I would argue. So just to go back to my previous experience in Southeast Asia, really this same playbook that I was seeing in these places really came to be how things were working in the West as well. So this brings us a little bit more to Germany. So my first caveat is that whilst I have a German name and a German passport, I grew up in Australia and I don't have German language. So this is why this is also in English. So thank you very much for indulging me. But we also, to do this report, we worked very closely with a range of German specialists and advisors who helped us do this mapping, who read the documents, who helped us understand what was going on, who provided the political and historical context. And I brought this skill set of, having looked and mapped at other parts of this complex and how it works, and therefore how we might apply or look at this situation through a similar lens in the German context. Why Germany? Because it seems to me that Germany is particularly important in terms of contemporary Western censorship, both because of the size of Germany and its influence within the EU, because of its history, and also because of the scope and scale of the system that has been developed there. I mean, in the EU, it is really the most influential country, I think you could argue. And I think for the Western Alliance and for transatlanticism, the bridge from Washington, D.C. gets off at Brussels and Berlin, I would argue. And so therefore, this kind of connectivity, this connective tissue means there's a huge amount of influence. And this system or this way of doing things, I would argue, predominantly came out of the US. Now, what's happening in the US has changed, partly for better, partly for worse. But so the system or the free speech challenges in the US are now very different to what they were under the Biden administration. But the system that existed under the Biden administration, this censorship-industrial complex approach, is very much alive and well, I would argue, in Europe and the UK. And I would say that the biggest three entities would be the EU, Germany, and the UK. These seem to be the worst from my estimation in my studies. Unfortunately, not a prize that you want to win. So if you want to go to the next slide. I'm just going to flash this briefly because we're going to get to this as this is just a little taster. So we essentially did a similar mapping project for Germany and thought, well, who are the key leading organizations in this system in the German context. And this is what we came up with. We'll come back to this at the end, and I'm sure you'll have questions. But first, I want to explain a little bit how we got there. So if you go again to the next slide. All right. Basically, over the past 6 to 7 months, we have been doing this research, and the outputs, one that you'll see on your table, is a very lengthy 20,000 word report. Thank you so much to Thomas's office for printing that out. It's very, very nice. In print, you'll also see you have a little card with a QR code on the back that you can also use to get to that report and to everything that we've produced. So this is kind of the first thing that takes you through essentially, who are the leading actors within the federal government, within the Länder, within the EU agencies, the influence of German Atlanticism, the key ministries, the key foundations, civil society in particular, because this is where a lot of the enforcement happens, and then the relationship to platforms and big tech. So I'm not going to go through the whole report here, given the time that is available to us, but I obviously invite you to read through that report and essentially our take on the context of what is going on, and then some sort of solutions and suggestions of where this might go in terms of how there might be a kind of pushback or what the new types of demands might be. I would just add one other additional bit of context in terms of why we undertook this. I've done 4 or 5 trips to Germany over the past couple of years and spent a month or so in Berlin last year meeting with people. And one of the things that kept coming up from talking to people is that whilst there are a lot of journalists who had uncovered things about this German system, who some of the key actors were, a full mapping had not yet been done. And so having done something similar for the US, we felt that this was a contribution that we could make, and that whilst in many ways the information here is publicly available, no one had really kind of put it all together in one place. So this is the aim for this. So if you go to the next slide. What we've done apart from this report is essentially built 2 databases. So the databases are one of more than 330 organizations that are working on what we broadly call content controls. So we don't use the word censorship all the time because it's very specific. Sometimes it feels a little bit hyperbolic. Sometimes actually there might just be an organization that's given a $50,000 grant to, let's counter hate speech in, this particular city. So some are much worse than others. Some are doing, maybe it's things that you might think, oh, well, it doesn't seem like terrible. So, but we want to capture the whole space more broadly, and then you can make up your mind about how bad or how okay that you might support the work that they're doing. So what you can do through this database, and if you go to the link that's on the card, and that hopefully we'll put up on the internet later, is you can see our ratings. We've given them 5 red flags to 1 red flags in terms of how bad we think these organizations are in our estimation. So we have it, and you can read the criteria of what those are, and then you can also tell us if you think we've ranked your organization, if you find your organization in there, or you're outside. You can tell us. Actually, when we did something similar for US federal grants, we did have some people writing to us and suggesting that their flag ratings were too high, and they argued that they should be rated lower. And we actually, this one particular person made a convincing argument, and we did actually rank them a little bit lower based on that. So there's 330 in here. Each one essentially has a profile. If you go to the next slide, you can filter all these things through, what topics they essentially work on, and there's, about 7 or 8 different ways of filtering the content. So this is just an example of the types of work that these NGOs or think tanks, etc., are working on. We went through and basically classified the work that they were doing, and I'll show some graphs in a moment that articulate that a little bit more clearly. Go to the next one. So this is an example of profile. So again, there's like 330 of these. So I also have to thank my team because I didn't write all of these because it was an enormous task. But every single entity has essentially kind of card or a profile that you can read, with the idea that, we're just kind of like dropping some breadcrumbs or trying to help surface these organizations for other advocates and journalists, but then we hope to go and write more about them and kind of get an understanding of who is really leading this system, and therefore ensure that those organizations are accountable for what they're doing, because there's also a huge amount of government money going to this, which we'll also go through and show you. To the next slide. So this is the other database, which is grants. There are 425 grants that we just found since 2015. These are mostly government grants, or EU or German government grants. The private foundation money is a little bit more difficult to discover, and actually, thankfully, the German government seems to be quite transparent in terms of the money that is giving away to this work, which is helpful for us. I mean, as it very much should be. But it also seemed that no one had gone through and really systematically looked at all of these grants. And it is quite a lot of work. I mean, this was probably 3 full-time people for 6 or 7 months to do all this work. So going through, hundreds and hundreds of websites, et cetera, to pull all of this out. So again, the idea is that it's a base for other people to then, a resource for other people to go and use to investigate much more deeply. If you go to the next slide. But here's some of the results that we found. So again, most of the funding that we're looking at here is federal funding and some EU funding. Private funding, again, was harder to discover, so it's probably underrepresented. In fact, and I think it's interesting just to see the origins, and I think the kind of amount of money per year tells a little bit of a story. I think, the kind of 2021 big increase is interesting. You're coming a little bit after COVID. 2016, things really start to kick off. Like in our kind of hypothesis, really kind of Trump and Brexit kind of key catalytic events globally. And this is obviously it's Germany, but our understanding or our view of this is that this is very much kind of global or a Western system that is very, very much interconnected. All the people that are meeting, they're doing the meetings in Berlin, then they're doing them in New York, then they're doing them in Barcelona, then they're doing them in San Francisco, et cetera. So it's kind of a global network of people. And so they obviously respond differently to different contexts, but they essentially have generated this kind of mass panic around disinformation and hate speech online together, I would say, like very, very much across borders. So you can go to the next slide. This is just the federal money, including the EU money and the federal government money. Again, you notice a similar pattern where there's a very, very sharp increase after 2020. There does seem to be a kind of plateauing, although this does go to 2025, and so not all the data is in there yet, so you wouldn't see quite as much. You'll actually see the German federal money has gone up in 2025, even though that year has ended. So that mountain is perhaps peaked, but it's certainly not coming down sharply as yet. So I think one of the really interesting phenomena is, in the US, this kind of censorship sparked a huge backlash. It was very, very unpopular. I would argue it was part of the reason that Trump even got in. I mean, there was kind of the cause celeb of Elon Musk, who obviously became a kind of deputy presidential campaigner. Again, whatever you think of that aside, it was a huge, huge issue for Americans in the previous election. People don't like being censored. In some ways, I don't actually understand why the European Union, why the German government, why the British government essentially playing the same tactics, because even from a do you want to win perspective, it seems like a losing battle to try and control the entire internet. Maybe they have another strategy or another plan or another set of objectives that I'm not privy to. But on the basic level of, is this going to actually help you combat your political adversaries? Actually, no, it seems to increase polarization rather than to decrease it. Next slide. This is a graph that shows when different organizations started doing this kind of anti-disinformation and anti-hate speech work. Of course, there was social media since, 2007, 8, 9, Facebook, etc. So there wasn't anything, I would say, tangible about the technology that changed in, say, 2016 or 2017. I think what there was a political change that set everyone into a panic about, people getting the so-called wrong information as an excuse for why they were voting in ways that the establishment didn't want them to vote. I think that's actually what's happening. And essentially, one of the main takeaways that I'm trying to get across to people is that this is a political program. This is not a program that is genuinely seeking to combat wrong information on the internet. Next slide. Funding this, again, this is skewed towards the government money because we don't have as much money, much information about the non-government funding, the private funding. So your Ministry of Education seems to be extremely busy. Democracy Leben really does seem to be funding an enormous amount of this, particularly of the 425 grants. I believe they account for actually more than 180 of them. So the amount is slightly less, but the individual grants really are more than a third of what we were able to document. So, when people say to me, like, who seems to be if you had to point to one entity or program, it seems to me the Democracy Leben is amongst or potentially the most influential one. So European Union is obviously funding more than this across the bloc, but this is the money that we were able to find just for Germany. In some ways, people might say, well, these aren't huge amounts. They're not billions. They're not hundreds of millions, but it's very cumulative. These are just the top ones. And, NGOs actually aren't necessarily that expensive. You can, run one for 3 or 4 or 500,000 euros and have quite a number of people still working for you. So it really does account for hundreds and if not thousands of people working on these issues across Germany. Next. These are the top recipients. MOTRA is a academic program that actually works quite closely with police. So it's very interesting to kind of read the profile that we wrote around them and whether or not some boundaries are being broken in terms of, what academics should be doing. Should they be collaborating quite so closely with authorities, or should they be a check on power? Should they be analyzing rather than being kind of advocates around this? So among here, people will likely recognize, but a huge amounts of the budgets essentially for this are coming from the government, and that one of the other arguments would be that these are not independent civil society organizations. These essentially become proxies of the government. One of the big differences between the US and Germany is that in the US, because of the First Amendment, they kind of had to hide a little bit, how much the government was funding academic institutions and NGOs to be doing this kind of work. In Germany, I don't think any such hiding needs to be done, partly because you don't have, very few countries have a First Amendment, but also I imagine culturally, some people think this is a very, very good idea. I actually think, whereas I think this is a very dangerous idea, when civil society, which should be a check on power, essentially starts working in partnership with power. Next. So, sorry, I missed. This is particularly the grants from Democracy Leben and who they are funding. Again, all of this is in the report, and there's a whole number of different information graphics in our website as well. Again, we're kind of dropping seeds or crumbs and pointers towards who are those influential organizations, and then with the hope that journalists and advocates are going to try and understand more about what these organizations are doing. Certainly, there are people who have written about these organizations in the past, or at least some of them. But I think there certainly hasn't been enough scrutiny of what this work is all about and what content they are pulling down. The next. And then, who is doing this? This is the breakdown. Again, this is of the 330 organizations that we wrote profiles on to, basically anyone we could find that was combating disinformation, combating hate speech, any kind of initiative to control the content that existed online, whether it be for bad or for good. Again, this is like a full kind of field survey of what is going on in the space. You'll note the very large representative of nonprofit organizations here. These are kind of really the foot soldiers for this system, along with the academic and research initiatives. And then, of course, there's government and foundation funding in there as well. But this is kind of your makeup of like who actually constitutes this system. Next. And then what are they actually looking at? So when they're kind of going around trying to work on these issues, how do they conceive of these things and to what degree? So again, every single one of these 330 organizations we essentially classified. What are the topics that they're working on? Sometimes they're surprising. For example, I thought that actually there might be more on Gaza. There didn't seem to be quite so much there. There's a lot more in media literacy than I would have thought of as well, which is interesting. There seem to be a lot of educational initiatives. Again, not every single one of these are kind of censorship initiatives, or some might actually even be things that people in this room would support. But I think it's very important to tease out which ones are promoting free and open inquiry and which ones are essentially being political weapons, essentially, to combat opposition, essentially, to break the rules of like the democratic discourse. Next. How do they justify the work they're doing, especially when they're looking at content being taken down? This is essentially a breakdown of that. It's interesting, actually, that you see conspiracy theories come up much more than we would say when we looked at the US. Threats to democracy seems to be a particularly German way of framing this phenomena or this problem, as they would say it, which we certainly didn't see in the same way in the US. The Russian narratives is also seems to be particularly local German phenomena as well. Yeah. And then how do they do this work? So again, there's actually quite a lot more education and literacy work than you would imagine. It's not all kind of checking, content flagging, getting content taken off the internet, but there certainly is quite a lot of that as well. But then again, this gives you a kind of understanding, like, what is this field actually working on? Again, that's why whilst we kind of say censorship in that kind of lead graphic, because they're really the worst organizations, the field itself is complex in that sense. And then they're doing different things, and you need to evaluate them quite differently rather than just painting everything with a broad brush. And then this back to the map. So again, this is essentially when we had to go, well, who are the top 60 organizations across these different areas of work that seem to work very much in concert. These are the top organizations that we came up with. Again, it is somewhat subjective, but it's also based on an analysis of the amount of money they're using, that they have available, the amount of the types of approaches they have, the ideology that they have. There's particularly organizations that, well, I think for anyone, actually, not just for someone outside Germany, like there was an academic initiative that runs something called Machine Against the Rage, which we found particularly strange and confusing. Obviously, that's the reverse of Rage Against the Machine. But these academics thought that their job was to essentially work with the machine to stop the rage. And I think that actually kind of summarizes the problem, which is some of the rage is very much justified. These are political questions. They are not questions of truth and falsehood. And people are weaponizing the idea of truth and falsehood in order to combat political opposition, whether it be on the left or on the right. I think oftentimes this phenomena is a little bit overly simplified, where people on the right will say, well, this is the right censoring the left. I wouldn't say that at all. What I would say is it's actually the extreme center censoring left and right populism. The enemy is populism. The enemy is the demos. The enemy is people. And it's the extreme center, or the kind of old or fading establishment, that is terrified and in a panic. And instead of confronting the real political and material issues of the day, the tactic seems to be to suppress those voices that are generating criticism and heightening the crisis that they find themselves in. The way through, to my mind, is not censorship and suppression. The way through is kind of a hard look at the real political context, the real political challenges, the real desires expressed by the people, ugly or beautiful. It's always some part in some part both. But censorship is not the answer to essentially confronting the political crises of the day. And we hope that essentially this mapping, these resources will be a tool for people who are trying to bring that conversation to the light and to find those solutions and find that way through to whatever this next political epoch is, that you will find in this resource to make that possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I think we just go on now with Aya, and then with Ulrike, and then there's, of course, plenty of stuff to discuss.
Aya Velázquez. I'm an independent journalist from Berlin, and since I do not speak English every day, I will read my statement. In 2020, I became aware of broad-scale censorship in Germany when the accounts of renowned medical doctors and professors were banned from social media. It was a life-changing experience for me because it starkly contrasted with the image I had from my country as a non-perfect, but basically functioning democracy where every controversial opinion could be expressed as long as it was not constituting a crime under German law. I thought censorship was an ugly thing from the past, and in a real democracy, a bad argument would not have to be feared by anyone because it would be outsmarted by a better argument. 2020, many people, myself included, woke up to a totally different reality. In July of 2020, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, the general director of the WHO, announced, "There will be no going back to the old normal." Tedros was right. In Germany, there was no going back to the old normal, and what the new normal meant was soon to becoming clear for everyone who dared to speak out against the COVID measures. Broad-scale censorship, deplatforming, demonstration bans, police violence, home searches, debanking, criminal trials for opinions, or simply making fun of politicians, defaming newspaper reports, framing, shaming, and blaming. The enemy may have changed over the years, but the pattern remains always the same, from COVID and COVID deniers to the Ukraine war and Putin apologists, the Gaza genocide and Hamas supporters, accompanied by the all-time classic of right-wing extremists, a category encompassing more and more regular citizens. 2020 censorship is an integral part of daily public life in Germany, and it has expanded and refined over the years. Features of the German censorship regime are international and platform-based, others are specific for the German context. Level, Germany is closely collaborating with censorship regimes of the WHO and United Nations like the UN Infodemic Campaign. Germany and all social media platforms operating on European soil fall under the DSA, the Digital Services Act of the EU, and social media platforms work hand in hand with German authorities like the Cyber-AZ to report online content directly to enforcement agencies. After COVID was over and Twitter was taken over by Musk, censorship has not disappeared, but platforms have moved from outright account banning to more subtle and invisible forms of censorship like AI-powered shadow banning, warning labels leading towards Wikipedia articles or government websites. Other features of the German censorship regime are rather unique and only comparable to the US or UK. One of them is lawfare. Government critics are bombarded with criminal proceedings. Most of those critics have never got in contact with law enforcement before COVID. Medical doctors, scientists, and judges had to endure home searches and went through criminal trials, resulting in years of conviction, loss of jobs, status, and pensions. In 2021, a new law was introduced, the Anti-Right-Wing Extremism and Hate Crime Act, reintroducing the offense insults against persons of public life. As a consequence, tens of thousands of criminal complaints were issued by German politicians and media celebrities against ordinary citizens. The best-known case is the Schwachkopf affair, where a German pensioner and his family received a home search for posting a satirical meme about former German Minister of Economy Robert Habeck. The German EU politician Marie-Agnes Strack-Zimmermann issues 200 to 250 criminal complaints per month. there are agencies specialized on these complaints. It has turned into a veritable sidekick business model for politicians and other public media figures. Since then, home searches have become a part of daily life for ordinary citizens in Germany. The cases are reported to enforcement agencies by a dense network of federal systems combined with NGOs. In 2025, trusted flaggers have been denominated by the German state in order to flag social media posts as hate speech or online violence and report them. A prominent recent case is the renowned German professor Norbert Bolz, who was reported by a federal unit and had a police visit at his doorstep for a satirical posting on X. After a 60 Minutes report about Germany's Hate Action Day under former Interior Minister Nancy Faeser, 3 German state prosecutors were asked about how people react when the police takes their phones from them. They answered they're shocked and laughed, boasting that taking people's electronic devices would be even harder than the actual punishment because people would depend on their phones, thereby admitting that home searches served as a punishment before an actual conviction had taken place. After critical media in Germany are under pressure since 2020, many got debanked once or several times. I myself got debanked 2 weeks ago without explanation. Former Interior Minister Nancy Faeser even tried to outright ban a medium, the right-wing medium Compact, issuing a home search of epic proportions, capturing obviously right-wing desks and chairs for months. After media often serves to frame and defame dissidents, journalists working in those outlets also complain about internal censorship. Texts are edited, reports deleted, interviews forbidden. The first and only German television report about DNA contaminations in COVID-19 vaccines was taken offline just after a few days because of an alleged lack of information about the measurement method. By these standards, a lot of government vaccine campaigns on public television would have to be taken offline as well. After political artists are under pressure, contracts are cancelled, public venues are morally pressured by local NGOs if they dare to rent their space to conspiracy theorists. Most venues bow down and cancel events, often last minute and without explanation. COVID-related Telegram groups were censored in app stores after German Interior Minister Nancy Faeser met with Telegram officials in winter of 2022. Also, Germany's Interior Secret Service, Verfassungsschutz, protection of the Constitution, plays a crucial role in the German censorship regime. 2 legal changes in 2021 allowed the agency not only to observe dissident groups, but also individuals who have committed no crime. Besides a change in the law, a new category of observation was created, Verfassungsschutzrelevante Delegitimierung des Staates, which is an unpronounceable term even by German standards. It means protection of the constitution relevant delegitimization of the state. The new category provides a convenient one-fits-all umbrella term for all dissidents not fitting into left or right-wing or religious extremism schemes. Although German Interior Secret Service is not a censorship entity per se, it frames individuals and groups in its yearly reports and encourages society to isolate them. I myself am observed by the German Interior Secret Service for my journalistic work. Despite all the censorship that I just described, we had the rare opportunity in Germany for a glimpse behind the curtain of the COVID measures in form of the so-called RKI files, which were leaked from Germany's foremost health authority, the RKI, the Robert Koch Institute. The German independent medium Multipolar fought for years to obtain the internal minutes of the panel, and it received a highly redacted version of the files and published it in March of 2024. Even in the highly redacted version, it became apparent that internal debates in the RKI differed very much from its public statements. Also in March of last year, an RKI employee got in contact with me. The person was guided by high moral standards and felt that the public deserved all the files, because the RKI is a tax-funded state agency. Over a period of 4 months, the whistleblower shared with me all internal minutes of the COVID crisis panel from January 2020 to July 2023. Completely unredacted, plus 10 gigabytes of additional material. I published the data in July of 2024 and held a press conference about it with 2 colleagues. German media reported about it over months, but not because they wanted, but because they had to. The central takeaway was undeniable and rehabilitated all the critics. COVID measures in Germany were actually not based on science, but on political will, a fact that was also confirmed by former RKI President Lothar Wieler last week in front of a German state parliament. The RKI gave recommendations, but politicians decided about which measures to take. After a few examples, people were censored if they warned that masks could have negative side effects. Meanwhile, the RKI in November of 2020. After mention still be made, it is disadvantageous and dangerous when masks are used by lay people. Influence is no longer possible. The consultations are taking place simultaneously and the RKI was not asked in advance. In Germany, demonstrations were forbidden proactively because it was suspected that people would not adhere to mask obligations. The RKI in May of 2020, there is no evidence for wearing masks outdoors. After people who criticized the testing regime were also censored, the RKI noted in April of 2020, the question arises in general whether the number of cases is currently increasing due to increased testing. An increase in testing can create an artificial increase without changing the epidemiological situation. And in May of 2020, test is essentially an implicit strategy addition that was proposed by the government. Overall, it's delicate because the politics have made specifications with which we don't fully agree. These must be integrated into the strategy as far as possible. After criticized measures for children like school closures, masks, testing at school, or child vaccination were censored and defamed, but the RKI already knew in February of 2020 that children were not prevalent in transmission chains and children were less at harm than with influenza. After the RKI was against broad-scale school closures, but the schools were closed several days after state. In May of 2021, the RKI noted that Health Minister Jens Spahn planned a vaccination schedule for children, although it was not recommended by Germany's vaccination authority, the STIKO. In April of 2022, we learned from the files that the testing regime at schools was introduced at the explicit request of Federal Chancellor Angela Merkel and not the RKI's focus. After King Point, pandemic of the unvaccinated swapped over from the United States and was enthusiastically embraced by German media and politicians, like former Health Minister Jens Spahn. In November of 2021, the RKI notes, the media is speaking of a pandemic of the unvaccinated. From a professional standpoint, this is not correct. The entire population contributes. Should this be addressed in the communication? The minister says that at every press conference, probably on purpose, and it can't really be corrected. After RKI already knew in May of 2021 about myocarditis cases in young men, but medical doctors who spoke out about it were publicly ridiculed as vaccine deniers. To conclude my argument, the disinformation of yesterday is the truth of today. The free expression of opinions and ideas is the basis for scientific and societal progress. In fact, the dialectic of thesis and antithesis is the only way science and society have ever moved forward. While the objectives in order to justify censorship may be novel, the consequences can be fatal. A recent example is the censorship of a study about possible harms of the COVID-19 vaccine during pregnancy on LinkedIn. Censoring essential health information warning about possible side effects of medication harms people and costs lives. Censorship is not compatible with science, the free and open society, and democracy. If this is the new normal, we should get back to the old one. Thank you. After
You, Aya.
After
Now, Ulrike, the turn is yours.
after After bei mir klappt's. Yeah, I'm very thankful to be here. I'm very thankful for having been invited. I happen to know Andrew since I think something like 2 years when he initiated all this work. And to start with this, I just took some notes when Andrew was talking. I think it's very important to stress this because I had the same sensation. When you said, Andrew, my world has shifted and you had been concentrating on other regions of the world, but then basically you shifted around and learned that there's something happening in the Western Hemisphere about media and consent. I would like to say that it's the same for me. I think there is a meta sort of level discourse here that you may argue that the so-called liberal democracies, or called the West, is under stress because the systems are not really functioning, and that what is happening is precisely what Andrew said, is that one political group now silence another political group. And I think this is a feature or a pattern that we can say it's more or less the liberal or the former liberal sort of parties or progressive parts of the society who try to silence other parts of the societies that have on different topics different opinion. So it comes down to a theorem where the liberal world, the so-called liberal world, is basically silencing the populist sort of part of the world. And this is precisely what Sheldon Wallin, even a couple of years ago, called inverted totalitarianism. So we have to cope with an extremized middle, which once upon a time was a liberal sort of progressive bubble, but which is now silencing the political opponent. And this is precisely what Yanis Varoufakis sketched out in his book, Tech Feudalism, because the instruments of this silencing most of the time come through the new digital world and comes through the internet. And I'm saying this because, in a way, it reflects my own life. Because many of the foundations and NGOs which are basically enumerated in this report, for instance, the DGAP, Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik, the German Marshall Fund, the ECFR, European Council on Foreign Relations, I worked for them. I worked for them before I was fired, actually, in 2013. So what I want to report is from own knowledge of these institutions that the inner dynamics of these NGOs described in the report were different in the time. I would say that the density of penetration, of the homogenization of opinions or positions was not as strong by then, so in the first decade of the 21st century, as outlined in the report. But clearly all these institutions positioned in the so-called European transatlantic consensus of the liberal West. In my experience, working experience, again, I worked in the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik 2000 to 2003, in the German Marshall Fund 2004 to 2007, and in the ECFR 2007 to 2013, I think it's important to note that critiques of that consensus, of the European transatlantic liberal West consensus, was allowed to some extent. You could, in articles, papers, or studies, criticize the government, criticize the governance structures of the EU, of the euro, criticize the EU's austerity policy after the banking crisis, criticize NATO, or the political implications of, say, the US policies in Maidan in 2014. And I would like to say that something slowly and invisibly must have changed, and this comes basically cuts across with what Andrew has been presenting. Something must have changed around 2011, 2014, roughly at the beginning of the second decade of the 21st century, so that we come now to this censorship network that we see here and that Andrew has described to us. I would like to stretch three arguments how the change could occur. One is certainly that the iPhone, everything in one bullet, appeared, Internet 2.0, more professional funding structures of NGOs, more foundations. Yeah, the German foundation law was boosted since 2008, following ever more companies, Telekom, Mercator, Bosch Foundation, like outlined in this report, were launched. The third aspect is that it can be shown through discourse analysis that when it comes to now the narrative on the Ukraine-Russian war, that the framing of the image of Russia
changed with the help of PR agencies roughly since 2007, since Putin spoke at the Munich Security Conference. By the way, I was present in Munich when that happened. And if you were in the room, Bayerischer Hof, and then you saw the speech, and then you read the Süddeutsche Zeitung the next day, you could really question whether you have been at the same sort of event. Yeah. What I can basically testimony of is that as I worked for the German Marshall Fund in the years 2004, 5, 6, 7, we did something that we called transatlantic trends, which was polling of sympathies of German citizens towards other countries, like how much the Germans like the US or like the UK, like the French, like the Spanish, and so on and so forth. And the data of 2003, 4, 5 show very precisely that German citizens had a 50-50 sort of positive judgment towards US citizens and Russian citizens. Basically 50% sympathy points Germany to US and 50% sympathy points Germans to Russians. Yeah. So it was not this sort of Russia is a danger and Putin is Hitler sort of thing. And it's very important that we can show today through empirical research that there was a rather positive image of Russia, say 15 years ago. And that is precisely what the report states in a way, because the report starts with control and surveillance features of non-Atlanticist positions moving out of the EU, NATO, OECD, WHO consensus. This is precisely what Noam Chomsky called already in his book of 1988, Manufacturing Consent. The NGO censorship network described in the report is the toolbox for the consent fabrication. It happens in a very subtle, invisible manner by discourse coalitions and subtle pressure of conformity. The Spanish philosopher Marina Garcés calls it the neutralization of critique in her book of 2016. And it was rather interesting for me to see in the report that all the data, how the money basically is exceeding in the spending starts roughly 2016. That's also what you mentioned, Trump, Brexit. Obviously a moment in time where the, say, Western elites have been totally stressed by the populist impulse, Brexit and Trump. And then the funding for defend democracy, defend against the right, basically was increased. And you can see this in the data of these report. So what I want to say, talking about this censorship network today, is that my first observation is that we need to go back roughly a decade to detect the origins and the origins of, I would call it, a hijacking of the NGO system, roughly a decade ago. I think I can say this also because I was dismissed by the ECFR in July 2013, one of the NGOs mentioned in this report, after having written some critical, and I was many times in the news and in speaking to in TV, after some very critical articles pointing to the increased interferences of US policy into European affairs. And this is precisely what I experienced. And here I relate my sort of personal experience to the report, is when in the report there's written that Wolfgang Streeck, a very renowned political scientist, and the article is quoted on page 14, footnote number 19 in the report, taking back control, states and state systems after globalism. And I quote Wolfgang Streeck, along with institutional anchors such as NATO and the EU, whose mechanisms of influence guarantee straightforward economic and security dependence, transatlantic think tanks like the Atlantic Council are key to the German censorship complex. So the Atlantic Council, if you had a working experience like me, who in the first decade was in all these institutions, it's precisely what Andrew says. All these people meet all the time in, be it Brussels or be it Washington or be it Berlin or Barcelona. This is a sort of hub with a very dense personal relations one to the other, and amalgamating all these NGOs, DGAP, German Marshall Fund, ECFR. So what I experienced is that there is an American slogan, which I often came across: Europeans invest in institutions, Americans invest in people. So if we discuss censorship networks, then we need to understand that, and I'm here to talk about the societal and the political consequences of this report, that we don't talk about classical forms of censorship, which is forbidding opinion, but what we talk more about is a people's network of people that share all the same opinion, and they do so sort of intrinsically, And they learn to not put into question or to question the assumptions of what they say. So we are talking about a personal network of political, academic, and intellectual elites that constitutes, in the sense of Wolfgang Streeck's finding, what is called in political science a discourse coalition, forging, containing, and repeating the ever-same narratives. The discourse coalition, here the Atlanticist discourse coalition, has a huge political impact on politics and on politics and policies through direct access to government officials, parties, and deputies. As Wolfgang Streeck describes, this transforms the definition of democracy from an essentially plebeian institution into moral attitude, a moral obligation to stick to an Atlanticist position. This obviously, and I think this is what the report is also showing, this obviously increases in times of war, as the report says, and as we can see in the data. War against citizens on COVID, war against, Ukraine, and then Gaza 2020, 22, 23. War times and war preparation need the homogenization of public opinion in order to mobilize and to make societies accept things that they would not accept under normal conditions. Going to war, spending money, inflation, calling for soldiers, training young men, etc., etc. So one of the political and societal findings of this report is certainly that the Atlanticist censorship complex in Germany amplified since the Ukrainian war started in February 2022 and Gaza on 7th of October 23, when, as the report states, morality is the security guaranteed by advanced preparation for a hybrid warfare regime that collapses the distinction between military and civilian spheres and combining efforts to influence and manipulate information with the familiar repressive operations undertaken by the state. In other words, the Atlanticist foreign policy agenda, one may add the Zionist foreign policy agenda, becomes a moral imperative. And that is what we could observe in Germany with this manufactured consensus in the broader geostrategic and geoeconomic sense. And that in a moment of time where the question is that what is the European interest? Because we are sitting here in the European Parliament, we are presenting this report. And so the European interest at a moment in time when obviously the Pax Americana is shifting towards a more multipolar world, the question for Europe reading this report is now, is this in the European, is the control or the manufactured consent that is manufactured in the way I tried to describe, is this in the geostrategic and in the geoeconomic interest of Europe? My answer is no. So the question is, can Europe tolerate, can the EU tolerate a manufactured consent which might be in contradiction to its own strategic and geopolitical interest? Today, Aya Velázquez has also pointed out a lot of examples, and I won't go into details here. There are ample examples in Germany that Europe banned or shitstormed or a Russian puppet or humiliated or sanctioned when you call for peace, when you call for diplomacy with Russia, when you say that the European Union once upon a time wanted to create a peace order with the Russian Federation, or you demonstrated against the genocide in Gaza, and so on and so forth. Francesca Albanese apparently is also now in the European Parliament. She could not talk in the Freie Universität Berlin, she could not talk at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. So we had a pianist in Berlin who sang peace songs and was arrested, briefly accused of treason. So there are very, very, very serious affection to protest in terms of peace, promoting peace. And I, as the founder of the European Peace Project, I can amply testify on this. So we also have now in books written about this, and this is very good, I think, because in Germany, I think the discussion is sort of waking up. For instance, Jonas Tögel, a young researcher and researcher on propaganda, has detailed in 2 books, NATO Cyber War Propaganda and its techniques. Yeah, okay, so no, I'm finished in a way, and the only thing perhaps in the last minute to bring down the report to a personal sort of experience, I was basically dismissed from my university in February 23 after I had written 2 critical books, one critic on the corona measures in March 22, and the other critical of the Ukraine-Russian war, in which I detailed basically the historical context of this war. And I talked about what today everybody can say. Today, proxy war is the wording. And just to one precise detail, which I think is important to look at this dismissal from the university with what the report is laying out. In the report is mentioned on page 43, the liber-net, which is one of these think tanks. And the liber-net had a project called Gegneranalyse zur Überwachung systemoppositioneller Medien. So they founded, they wrote a report about the surveillance of dissidents, system dissidents. And this was financed by the Ministry for Family and Education, up to 700,000 euros. So what I want to say is that the author of this Gegneranalyse, Markus Linden, is the same man who wrote the article in FAZ in which I was accused allegedly of plagiarism. So I think you can, in the way of the chronological sort of way, and also in the personal relations, you can see a relation between liber-net, financed of the government, being in this report as one of the instruments of the toolbox for sanctioning critical opinion, and then down to the persons who are writing Gegneranalyse, to the person who wrote the article of plagiarism on me, that there is obviously, or not obviously, but there is a suggestion that it might be, a sanctioning which could reach into universities and which could basically sanction and organize dismissals from universities. I'd like to end up with saying I'm not the only one. There are other professors that have been that came into the cursor, if I may say so. Yeah, for instance, Johannes Warwick of University of Halle, who is also a very critical professor, Stefan Lust, University Bremen. And you can see that there is silencing and there is intimidation of these professors if they dare to move out of a certain consensus. And I would agree with Aya Velázquez that in Europe, which is always proud of enlightenment, of Rousseau, of Voltaire, of the humanism of Kant and eternal peace, this should not be allowed in the realm of what we understand that Europe is good for. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I guess you described the situation, highlighted the situation from very different angles. I mean, I have one question, also following up on what you said, Ulrike. I mean, the question is, who's hijacking whom? I mean, is the NGO world hijacking sort of the government by, that is what you kind of suggested, with these American transatlantic organizations, which sort of impose their will on, how we exercise the right of free speech? Or is it the other way around, that the government pays the NGOs? I mean, we have discussions here in the EU, on Mr. Timmerman, who paid with funds from the European Commission some NGOs to basically advocate for the Green Deal. And I mean, I find it somewhat critical how non-governmental organizations take money from the government to do the job of the government. And it's even more paradoxical that the European Parliament appropriates funds to these NGOs to be lobbied by these NGOs, so to speak. I mean, when it comes to how can we resolve this situation, I mean, I wonder, would it be helpful to reestablish the difference between state and society, between government and NGOs, so that this distinction is no longer blurred, but that it is clear that if the government, as it does with criminal law, for example, I mean, that is the classical idea. The government sets the rules, and if somebody does not comply with the rules for what is admissible free speech, the government steps in with criminal law, but not with all these subtle sort of intermediate layers where you don't know, are they authorized by the government? Is this just being paid for by the US? Or no, I mean, I think this is what makes it so complicated. But I mean, the question really is, how can we solve this problem? How can we sort of disentangle and to re-civilize these structures that, I mean, you have very, very clearly analyzed. But I mean, when you see how complicated it is, and when you look, where does the money come from, and what do they really have to say, and who authorizes them to, I mean, the trusted flaggers. I mean, who is the one who authorizes the trusted flagger, and what authorizes him or her to do that? I mean, I think this is really complicated. I mean, maybe first to Andrew, because I mean, you've analyzed, this whole complicated network.
You change it after.
I press this. Hello, 1, 2, 3. Oh, that'll do. It's a nice shot. There we go. Well, I think one is increased transparency in the reporting of the NGOs. I mean, oftentimes they do. You can find information about who they're getting their money from, but I think it should absolutely be clear. I also just think some of this money should not be being spent by the government. I think some of the operations and activities, partly they should just stop and not be happening at all. The second is where they do happen, it should be far more transparent, like who's receiving the money and essentially what the restraints are. I mean, obviously, sometimes these things are kind of silent restraints where it's like, well, it was nice to get that €500,000 from the ministry or whoever. We'd like to get another $500,000. And so we know what to do. We know what not to do in order to get $500,000. No one necessarily always tells you exactly what it is that you shouldn't do. You kind of know what pleases people and what displeases people. So I think, there's been absolutely way too much integration between the NGO sector and the government agencies and the commission, etc. itself. That part, again, half that money should just stop being distributed. Any part that remains needs to be much, much more transparent. And they're really not NGOs. They're kind of, they should have a different name. I mean, it was interesting because in Southeast Asia, it was very clear when things were essentially government NGOs. In the Philippines, people would talk about gongos all the time. They'd be like, oh no, that's a gong. Don't talk to them. They're a gongo. They're not a real NGO. They're not really independent. They work essentially for the government. And this was very clear to people that these manipulations were going on. For some reason in the West, people in that sector are very insufficiently cynical, even curious about all of this money. In some ways, perhaps it's not in their interest to be curious and cynical about this money because, that's how they pay their rent. But I think you need a massive reform of this sector. I think it's bloated. I think there's too many NGOs, and I think they're not independent, and they're doing political work at the behest of governments that should be operating independently.
After
Yes, what I'd like to add to your, add as answer is obviously is a huge fabric, as I said, is a personal sort of, people know each other, and it's very sublimated. I think my point here is to understand that there is no, in a way, censorship that somebody tells you, you must think this or you must say that, or gives you instructions. There is a sort of societal assumption that this is what you should say or you better say or what makes you promotion. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of career interest in if you take that position and not another position. So I think what Marina Garcés calls the neutralization of critique is the moment that you realize that you better say this because then you get there is a very strong factor, and this is a very sublimated sort of tool. You cannot point to somebody who gives that money for that to happen. So the mechanisms, I think, are sublimated. And this makes it so hard because then it's not so evident to blame somebody for a whole system shifting in opinion. What I mean is it's still, it's a different thing, say, to fund the Bosch Stiftung, to give it money for, say, promoting Franco-German Youth Cooperation, and what classically the Bosch Foundation would do, or to promote Franco-German relations in the sense of whatever peace architecture for Europe, or to do democracy promotion and to say you need to have pupils instructed how they need to read newspapers. So there is also a shift in goals, and there is a shift in how to control sort of political goals. I mean, to be very precise, there was now an Antrag in the Bundestag about the dual use, in which is questions, the technical elements in technical systems with China on export, dual use. So, and now there is a working group who wants or shall analyze this, and people from the DIHK and whatever DGAP are invited, So the same crowd which is mentioned here, So if you want to analyze technical issues, you better invite Fraunhofer Institute or the TÜV or people who have a real sort of technical knowledge about it, You could also say, why don't we do the same thing on Israel? Because if I'm not mistaken, the pager sort of incident happened with Israel dual use, So what I mean with this consent, manufactured consent, is where do you shift the opinion in a very subtle way just because you make something an issue and another thing you don't make an issue, And these are processes which are money-driven, but not only money-driven. They are also driven by political network, and that is personal opportunities, the things you rather don't mention, the things you better mention, and so on and so forth.
All right, I would open the floor. And
After
much for this really important meeting. My name is Andrew Lowenthal. I started in the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe a bit more than 1 year ago, a report in freedom of expression. And this was a heavy debate there because they did not want to have it in the way I wanted to have it, because they said, media freedom, we have a lot of reports. No, it's this freedom of expression issue is about the feeling of ordinary people to freely express their views. And this is a bit the difference to media freedom. And this is directly related to the question of democracy in itself. That's the main topic of that report. I had to step down. I was the initiator and I was rapporteur in end of June because I'm not represented in the German parliament anymore, as long as there is no recounting in Germany. But I just wanted to point to one. As we talk about Germany, there is a long-term survey by Allensbach in Germany starting from 1990 with always the same question. Is it, can you freely express your opinion, or is it better to be careful? In 1990 was nearly 80% of Germans said, I can freely express my opinion, and 16, 17 said, it's better to be careful. Now it's 50-50. So there's a huge development, and this was, and I agree very much with Aya and Ulrike. That has a lot to do with happened in the last decade, and had a lot to do with COVID, had a lot to do with Ukraine war, and a lot to do with Gaza. So this is, I just want to agree, and the term gongos, it's sad that it's not used in Germany, but I think it's the right term, government organized non-governmental organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
One important point for me is if we consider, because you mentioned this report since 1949, that
since 1990, the survey of
Allensbach, that we going back in the history of the Federal Republic, I think we had a more or less functioning left-right scheme, and we could voice, if you remember the 60s or whatever, you could voice, say, anti-American Vietnam protests, whatever, we also had Iraq, 2003. And if you just go in the historical dimensions of whether we had the huge peace movement in 83. So if you just compare the Vietnam peace movement 83, Iraq 2003, and say since 2013, which is what Andrew and I described, I think we could make the more or less empirical argument that something has changed and that fundamental critique of what is happening, especially if you criticize war, that this is more or less undermined in subtle ways. Yeah. And there you have a very huge homogenization of public opinion, or the feeling that you don't dare to speak out loudly on this. And this is at least intriguing for a country that has seen different decades of history in which the protest was more articulated and could be more articulated, when even the newspapers, remember Süddeutsche or Die Zeit in 83, Marion Gräfin Dönhoff, whatever. I mean, the SPD, look at the SPD in these times. So the real question for me is how it could be engineered more or less through networks like this, that there is a sort of homogenization of this opinion in such a massive way. That is my question. And then your question is right. How do you break through it?
Great. Just a very naive proposal. When I studied, under the Constitution, we have basic rights. They have to be exercised within certain limits. And it's the government who determines, are these limits observed, are they not observed? Let's say, and when I look at the internet giants, at the Facebook and Instagrams and so on of this world, they are dominant providers. So they cannot choose who's allowed to access the network and who is not. Under German competition law, everybody would, if you're a dominant provider, you have to give access to everyone. So every opinion should be possible. And it's if you're violating a criminal law, if you're violating the honor of somebody else, or so on and so forth, it's the state prosecutor who steps in, and you don't need the self-censorship of the provider. You don't need the Bundesnetzagentur, who sort of authorizes or the trusted flaggers and all. You basically wouldn't need that under a very sort of traditional set up in a liberal democracy. After wonder, maybe the problem is that the internet is just such a huge venue where you can utter so many personal opinions that could not be subject to criminal law, that you need to have some sort of some sort of pre-judgment instance institution, basically, to not leave all this work to the police and to the state prosecutors and so on and so forth. But I would say, I find it completely alien to sort of my understanding of the rule of law in a liberal democracy, that you have such a blurred situation, where private money, private NGOs, some supported in some quite often very intransparent way by public money, public authorities. I think this is completely contrary to any traditional idea of the rule of law. So I wonder what would happen if we were just to reinstate the situation, the classical situation in a liberal democracy.
Okay, I can say something about it. I think this is not possible because since 1990, we live in a totally different world. We have a world free of blocks. Capitalism has basically taken over. We can argue about if this is still real capitalism, but it's a one world system with a few exceptions. And my friend C.J. Hopkins from Berlin wrote about this issue also extensively, and he has a very convincing theory that a system that has no external enemies anymore moves towards fighting internal enemies. And this is what is happening now. So it's basically a clear and bold operation, which is a military term. This is exactly what it's doing. It is securing it's exactly. Yeah, the Neue Mitte, the third way, exactly. And all this implies that we become more Asianized because there is a difference between very authoritarian systems in the East and very individual systems in the West. And one strategy goes, we should become more one. And so that needs, by definition, that the West becomes more authoritarian. So to answer your question, I think there is no going back because it is a systems approach. The system is going into this direction. And this is why it's happening. After
I'm going to add something to that.
Interesting theory.
After
Hello.
You have too much.
Okay. And I think actually this explains a little bit why there's this conflation, right? So you talk about some of these things about the criminal activities that there are obviously online and real defamation, etc. These things are very deliberately conflated. Like, so a kind of a legitimate critic, like I or Ulrike or Jay Bhattacharya, whoever it might be, gets swept up into this same system. So the kind of truly libelous person is treated exactly the same as the epidemiologist from a prestigious university. I think it's very, very deliberate because it also sends a warning signal to anyone else who might be thinking of dissenting that, well, you don't want to you don't want to be smeared, you don't want to be essentially cast out of society. I mean, in some ways it's a very old system of kind of, hanging people on the road, into town to say, well, don't do what they did because the same thing will happen to you. But this is a kind of digital kind of system of discourse discipline, right? Like these are the boundaries, and the boundaries have become very, very deliberately narrowed. And the question that Ulrike is asking, or the question I guess we're all asking, is what was the process of this narrowing of discourse? Because in some ways, the whole promise of the internet was that we were going to have this massive widening of discourse. In some ways, you might say, well, it's precisely because we had this widening of discourse that therefore established powers need to therefore rein that in and create a new kind of disciplinary mechanism so that it didn't go out over the boundaries and essentially threaten their political power, which I think it very, very clearly does at this point. You're disagreeing, Thomas. Pray tell.
No, I'm not disagreeing. I think it's probably right what you're saying. I'm just wondering, how would I go about, this new information landscape? How would I go about? And when you see, you have these the Googles and the Metas and the Alphabets of this world. They are, of course, extremely dominant companies. So I would certainly not leave it to them. You need to regulate. But I would just say probably the easiest way to regulate, what they now do, what I found outrageous, I'm not a friend of Donald Trump, but when X or Twitter decided that he cannot put messages on Twitter, I think this is outrageous. How can a private company sort of steer the political discourse? This is in particular if they're so dominant as Twitter was in their area. So I would say, the first thing, and this is a general rule of law, is that if you are a dominant provider, everybody needs to, and you need to grant access to everybody. Mm-hmm. So every opinion can appear on Instagram, X, you name it. Mm-hmm. And then the question is, of course, there are messages that are clearly violating other people's rights, that are clearly subject to criminal laws in Germany, which, however, need to be construed, interpreted in a restrictive way. That's the nature of criminal law. Basically, you need to prove that somebody has really committed a crime. So, but this is the job of the government. I just think, you need to. It should. We have this discussion on DSA, obviously, and I just wonder. How do you go about that? Of course, you cannot leave everything to the digital providers and basically have them rule, all these issues with the algorithms and so on and so forth. They wield a tremendous power if they're not being regulated, if these algorithms need not to be made transparent, for example. But then, if you manage to do that, after probably leave it to the authorities that enforce essentially the criminal law, because that's the only one that applies, where the freedom of speech finds its limits in a liberal democracy. I'm not saying it's wrong what you're saying. I just say what happened that we allowed that sort of this difference between I mean, what is private society and the control of the state, how this difference was completely blurred. I mean, this is what I take from your study, you know. I mean, it's incredible how these very intransparent, very opaque structures, how could they develop, and how could they have become so powerful?
How could they? I would agree with Aya to give response to this. A system that does no longer allow the critiques in the system needs to invent enemies. Yeah, because then the mechanism system theory is, and that's what's happening. I mean, there are many books written about that. For instance, with respect to Germany, the liberal, so-called liberal, whatever middle is inventing two enemies. One internal enemy, which is the AfD, needs to be forbidden. And the external enemy is Russia and Putin. Yeah. So in order to legitimize its own authoritarian closure, the liberal middle invents two enemies. That's the process. And I think this is largely analyzed. And I think Aya is right on this. But I have 2 points. I mean, Mr. Macron and Mr. Merz were meeting, I think the day before in Berlin to talk about digital sovereignty. And I think that, I mean, we're talking here in Brussels, in the European Parliament. I think whatever it is, but if we want to move out of the GAFA complex, Europe should invest in own mechanisms and in own platforms, and then move the service out of the US in a way, yeah. And then we have probably a better regulatory power if Europe wants to do it differently, yeah. And the third point is, I think if you want a solution, we need to talk about symmetric law. I mean, Aya talked about lawfare, and what we see with all this shitstorming and banning and whatever is that many people say, Habeck, for instance, which is also mentioned in the report, can attack whatever old widow in Germany and send the police, yeah, and other people who are much larger shitstorm than with Schwachkopf, yeah, which is a sort of whatever soft insult, which is whatever we may discuss, yeah, yeah. But if I had reacted to any insult made on me for months, which were much larger than Schwachkopf, yeah, you have no tools. There is lawfare, and we have a law system now which has asymmetric law. Which means that, for instance, what Aya was pointing to, you could say we would need an amnesty for the last trials and court cases in which some of the corona measures have been discussed, yeah, mask and so on and so forth. And you could argue that now with new evidence, because we have now the RKI files, that the decisions are definitely wrong because they were based on wrong assumptions. Yeah, so we could start a political process in saying we would need to give amnesty to those who were right, and the courts basically judged in the wrong way because they were working on an assumption that the RKI got it right. Yeah, so there is also a democracy must be able to revisit its own decision, and I think if we want to go for trust, building trust in society again. For instance, on the court rulings on corona and the asymmetric warfare, we could perhaps start a discussion, and other countries did it. Slovakia, Spain, other countries did amnesty on court cases. Slovenia on corona, yeah, and the same for basically banning people from. I mean, if you were to ban people because they lie, the first person that needs to be banned is Drosten and Wieler and whoever. Yeah. So so there is such an asymmetry, which I think needs to be caught up.
Yeah, I'm going to quickly add a couple of things. And when you ask me how did this happen, I think through a series of crises, real and hyped. So how do you provide the justification for increasing measures? It's DG. The DSA, you have crises. So you hype the crises and you say, well, we need, I think this is also partly Ulrike's thesis, which is, these provide the moments, the events that make you go, wow, we need to respond to this, therefore we need these new laws, or therefore these crackdowns are justified, and you have this kind of creeping system until it kind of reaches a critical mass and becomes kind of part of daily life. So I think we've seen those, whether it's a kind of migrant crisis, it's Trump, it's Brexit, it's COVID, it's Ukraine, it's Gaza, et cetera, So these things have all kind of like boiled the water more and more that we're in. So yes, and I agree that doesn't mean that there should be zero regulation on companies at all. And actually, the concept of digital sovereignty was digital sovereignty that they were proposing. I agree with, but where Mr. and Merz are coming from is very, very different to where I'm coming from, and that their digital sovereignty is a kind of, we want to control what the people say. It's not actually a real digital sovereignty where the people are sovereign. It means governments and the EU control the digital domain. So I think there does need to be an alternative to like Musk and Zuckerberg, etc. But Merz and Macron and the EU are certainly not. No, I definitely understood that wasn't what you were proposing. The problem is that a lot of people in the liberal progressive space have no understanding that actually it's them or many of their colleagues that have contributed to this new kind of panic around hate speech and disinformation and have operationalized the crackdown on speech. Even if it's a kind of extremist centrist project, it has kind of been made possible by this Faustian bargain by liberals and progressives with the state because of the panic around particularly right populism. That's provided the kind of, oh, well, we can suspend the rules, we can throw out our normal ethics and morals and principles because, fascism is, coming in 5 minutes. Therefore, all of this is okay. So that lesson needs to be learned. I think actually in some ways, one of the one of the kind of silver linings around Gaza, I think, is that some or more progressives and have kind of understood that actually this system will also come for you.
In my people is, if we still have time, it's a question to the entire panel, also including you, Thomas. You or don't you agree that the German public media system needs a change too? Because everything what we've heard so far, I highly appreciate your research and what you've said. What I'm trying to hint at is that the German system, public media system, is a system based on broadcasting councils. Politicians sit from conservatives, from the socialists, from the Greens, from all parties. So wouldn't you agree that the mere fact that politicians sit on these panels decrease public opinion already? Besides the point that we have billionaires owning Facebook and other platforms. Because if we can make division of power in the public media, which is financed by household fee, Rundfunkbeitrag, whatever you want to call it, would that enhance or make the system better? Or do you think that this could be a decisive change for, I don't know, a broad spectrum of opinion?
One of my questions, and it goes from this to Andrew, is whether you intend to do a similar report on other European countries, because at least it is interesting to see that, say, the French opinion or the Spanish, Portuguese, Italian opinion, say, on Ukrainian war, Russian-Ukrainian war, or even on Gaza is totally different. I mean, in Italy, for instance, with Gaza, you have no problem to voice protest, yeah? In France, you could see Villepin, who is a former MP, you could see him on France 2, strongly arguing against genocide in Gaza, and he was a former MP and nothing happened. The Irish Parliament and the Irish sort of public is very anti-war, anti-Gaza and anti-Israel, yeah. Then you go to the UK, you have a pretty different thing. I was just in London and it's pretty sort of, say, Zionist, whatever, yeah. So the interesting thing for me is, or I think I would encourage you to go country by country, because that in itself might be interesting to see. Yeah. With respect to the proper question whether it can be changed in Germany, I think some forces are working on it to cut the Staatsvertrag. I mean, there's a question of coalition, and I think the first local country government run by the AfD, that would be the consequence, withdrawing from the Staatsvertrag. I mean, this is an obvious goal of some of the political forces in Germany. Whether it happens or not, I can't say. What I would like to say is I would love to see something like a öffentlich-rechtlicher Rundfunk. In itself, I don't think that a media landscape like in the US, which is entirely private, is the solution. Yeah. So the risk that we skip the baby with the bath-tube is a high risk. Yeah. I would like, in a sense like Thomas, I'd like to bring back the öffentlich-rechtlicher Rundfunk to a functioning system which allows critiques in the inside so that the critique does not need to move to alternative media. Yeah.
Well, maybe, I guess what we observe in the moment with the öffentlich-rechtliche Rundfunk is the extreme center trying to, to hide itself in its, I don't know what the English word for Wagenburg is, I mean, that they're basically fighting against, any broader opinion that does not fit with the quote mainstream thinking of the extreme center. I mean, they're getting more and more extremist. I must say, when I look at, I still listen every day to Deutschlandfunk. I mean, the other day they had Informationen am Morgen. Within 30 minutes, you had Roderich Kiesewetter and Marie-Agnes Strack-Zimmermann, two proponents of exactly the same opinion. Of course, very fairly radical when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. But I mean, this is publicly paid for public radio. And I mean, when I look in the past, I mean, they had terrible conservatives, making comments in the öffentlich-rechtliche Rundfunk, which I hated, but I think it was very civilized that you really had a very broad spectrum of different opinions. And I mean, if there is such a thing as public radio, publicly, taxpayers' money financed radio, needs to encompass the entire society. There cannot, by definition, there cannot be a Brandmauer against 25% of the population. That's clearly impossible.
I think until something changes in Germany with the media, it's a very, very heavy ship and it won't change its direction so fast. But what I see is that in new media, the alternative media are getting quite a rush and a lot of numbers. A lot of people are just not consuming the conventional media anymore. And this is why it's observable that traditional media are also panicking, because the numbers are quite intimidating that some little YouTubers made. And also every kind of defamation attempt kind of backfires. One could see that when Jan Böhmermann tried to diss a YouTuber and outed him, put his name in the public. The YouTube channel of this YouTuber just exploded. He has now 500,000. And this is why the types of Jan Böhmermann even corners this, because they feel threatened. They know that there is a power, the power of public opinion, which is shifting, and they can't really bring it back because it's the experiences that people make with types like Jan Böhmermann for many years. He considered children like rats. He named them rats, and it's a lot of experiences that accumulate over the years so that people lose trust. I think this is the way which is going right now. I don't think defunding of the public media is realistic at the moment, but the new media are kind of stepping in the game.
Hey, well, I just got a signal that we have 2 minutes left and we have a lot of food left. Huh? So please help yourself. Thank you very much for this really interesting presentations, and I hope we were a small but very distinguished circle here. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.